just kind of give a little introduction to the Urbanist in case some folks are new. The Urbanist was founded in 2014, and we focus on good city making and good urban policy. We're based in Seattle, but we kind of look throughout the region. And I'm the executive director at the Urbanist, and I'm always looking to encourage folks to get involved in whatever way they're interested in, whether that's volunteering, whether that's sending out a letter to your electeds, whether that's advocacy, or just donating to support our work, to support people who are doing that here. So you can always reach me at my email, which is doug@theurbanist.org. Reach out on social media. And, there's plenty of reminders about events, and there's always the donate button on the website if you're interested. And we're really thankful to have such great guests tonight. And I'll let Patrick kind of introduce Representative Fitzgibbon more, but we were happy to endorse him this year during the process, and last time too, just because he's such a strong urbanist. I don't recall if you actually drew a challenger this year, but it was still one of the top candidates we interviewed. So that's always good to see people who are really engaged on these issues.
Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Doug. I just wanted to welcome everyone to the Urbanist December Meetup. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your lives to engage with what's going on in our region, to join us and fellow Urbanists. So I'm going to introduce Joe, and then he is going to share some of his thoughts and what he's working on, what he hopes to work on, and some of his accomplishments. And then we will open it up to questions. I've got a list that we've been compiling that people submitted when they registered, as well as some that people have submitted in the chat. If you have more questions, please put them in the chat. So as a way of introduction, Joe Fitzgibbon represents the 34th Legislative District, including Seattle, Burien, White Center, Vashon, and Murray Island, in the Washington State House of Representatives. He was elected in 2010, and since 2014, has chaired the House Energy and Environment and Energy Committee, which has jurisdiction over issues including climate change and land use laws. His top legislative priorities have been fighting the climate crisis, fighting the housing shortage, restoring ecosystems to health, and expanding healthy transportation choices. With that, it's all yours, Joe.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks everybody for taking some time this evening for a preview of some of the things that we're working on for 2021. So I'll start with a little recap of some of the progress that we've made on housing affordability and housing supply issues in the last 2 years. I had a bill that passed into law in 2019, House Bill 1923, which I would say is the biggest step forward that the legislature has taken on addressing the housing shortage in many years. And so that bill started out much more ambitious than it ended up, but it's actually been really impactful, even though it ended up almost entirely voluntary for local governments. So whereas it started out as a bill that would have required cities over a certain size to increase their housing capacity in whatever way they chose to do, it was still a mandate on cities to tell cities, medium to large cities, that the state was requiring them to increase housing capacity. Through the legislative process, that didn't have enough support to pass, but we moved towards an incentive-based approach where $100,000 in grant funding would be available to any city that chose to take one of a whole array of actions to increase the housing supply, including upzoning around transit, including allowing accessory dwelling units, allowing more duplexes and triplexes and in various lots throughout their city, or a number of other options. And one of the things that we found through that was that it is really true that one of the reasons so many cities have been slow on to make those land use changes has been just a lack of resources, and that even just $100,000 planning grant, which to me didn't sound like a whole lot of money for a city, was attractive enough that a lot of cities took us up on that. A whole lot of cities throughout the state decided to take actions to allow more missing middle type housing types, to allow more accessory dwelling units, to adopt a housing action plan to address housing affordability in their part of the state. So that's been really positive. Another part of that component of that bill was a safe harbor from appeals under SEPA and the Growth Management Act for these actions. So that is something that we have heard from cities for a long time, is that, you know, we want to take steps to allow more housing growth in our jurisdiction, but we're afraid we're going to get appealed. And that is, Olympia is a great example of that. Olympia adopted a missing middle ordinance allowing a much greater diversity of housing types throughout their city, and they were appealed to the Growth Management Hearings Board. So, and they lost there. So that safe harbor from appeal has been helpful to Olympia in going back to, you know, to resolve that Growth Management Hearings Board case. You know, SEPA appeals are another example where, you know, I think that this crowd knows that Seattle's ADU ordinance, Seattle's mandatory housing affordability up zones were both very significantly delayed by SEPA appeals. So by providing safe harbor from appeal for under those laws, we've really made it a lot easier for cities to choose to move ahead with those kinds of actions. This year in 2020, we built on House Bill 1923 with House Bill 2343, which just expanded the kinds of actions that were eligible for protection under that law. Another thing that we've done in 2343 is direct the Department of Ecology to remove remove parking from SEPA, to say that, you know, parking is no longer considered a positive element of the environment the way it was when SEPA was first adopted in the 1970s, and that it should no longer be used as a tool to drive more parking spots being required for a housing development. So we directed Ecology to remove SEPA from both the environmental checklist under SEPA as well as an element of the environment under that law. So those, I think, are some important steps that we've taken so far. One other thing that we did in 2020 was pass an accessory dwelling unit bill, which it started out much more ambitious than it ended up, as laws tend to do. By the time it passed, it's still impactful in that it prevents cities from requiring extra parking for ADUs when they're located within a quarter mile of frequent transit service. And so Seattle's already taken that step, but it's good to see that now that's one of the few aspects of that law that were mandatory on cities, separate from the other laws I mentioned. That's it's pretty infrequent for the legislature to pass a mandate on cities or counties like that, because there's just a strong tradition of local control over land use in our state. And there's a lot of legislators who are former local elected officials and really value that, that goal of maintaining local control. And so it's pretty infrequent that we actually get enough support to pass a local zoning mandate like we did with the ADU bill. So on the horizon, I don't expect there to be additional zoning mandates that are high on the list that get done in the coming session. I could be wrong about that. Legislators could be working on that, and I'm just not aware of it yet. But you know, just my political read is that it's we've been more successful with incentive-based approaches than we have with the mandates, and that in part is because, for the reason I said before, a lot of local electeds, both Democrats and Republicans, come to the legislature and really fight to maintain city and county control over zoning. And so that said, a couple of things that are high on the to-do list for 2021. One is to incorporate climate change planning explicitly into the Growth Management Act. And Representative Davina Dewar from Bothell introduced a great bill in 2020 in her freshman term to add climate as a goal under the GMA. We passed it out of the House, which was actually a huge achievement, but it stalled in the Senate, as a lot of things that are important to me tend to do. But this bill is going to be more ambitious than that, not just adding climate as a goal under GMA, but actually add specific climate planning requirements as a new element of the Growth Management Act. So not just a goal, but actually some specific work that local governments have to do, particularly in the largest counties in the state, both to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by channeling growth into places where transit is more of an option, as we all know well, infill development is much lower in its carbon intensity than greenfield development, which is what historically most development has been. So we really, I think, have good traction on that. FutureWise has been very active in advocating for this change to GMA. It's been a priority of theirs and of mine for a long time, since before I was elected. But I think we're starting to see alignment over that being a real priority for 2021. One thing that's important as a part of that is, as we add new requirements for local governments, I think it's important that the state help pay for those requirements, because local governments are so squeezed fiscally. It's something that, you know, oftentimes I think gets looked at as just a a red herring. Oh, they're just saying this because they don't want to do it. In my experience, it really is true. And that is part of the lesson of 1923. Because local planning departments are so constrained, they tend to be general fund expenditures for cities. So they're competing with a lot of really high priorities. A lot of planning departments haven't recovered their budgets or their staffing levels from before the last recession, and so they're still operating in a bare bones capacity. So I'm really hoping that we can fund that climate planning work for cities and counties that are required to do it. And I'm proposing to do that through carbon pricing. That's another thing that we've had long battles on in the legislature, never quite gotten there, but that by pricing carbon pollution and asking the emitters of the largest amounts of greenhouse gases to pay the state for the privilege of polluting our air, we can actually generate a lot of money and use that money to invest in a whole array of things that are important, including multimodal transportation, wildfire prevention, the working families tax credit, electrification, weatherization, but also climate planning under GMA. And so I think it's probably unlikely we could get that bill, the climate element of GMA, through without the state providing the resources for local governments to do that work. So that's, I think, an integral part of strategy in terms of getting that passed. More specifically on housing, I think there's multiple proposals to strengthen the housing element of GMA. The housing element is a requirement that governments planning under GMA adopt a housing element as part of their comprehensive plan to address housing affordability and housing types, but it's not very strong. It doesn't really have a lot of teeth in it, and there's not a lot of ways that citizens who care about housing affordability can challenge a local land use plan for being inadequate on that front. And so there's ideas out there from both the building community and the realtors on one side, as well as from FutureWise on the other side, that take pretty different approaches for how to add teeth to the housing element. I'm hoping we can find ways to unify around something that that both the business interest and the environmental interest can support as a way to strengthen that component of GMA. In my experience in the legislature, it's very rare. In fact, I can't really think of an example in the 10 years I've been there of a land use law passing over the strong objections of any of these four groups: business, cities, counties, and environmental advocates. It's sometimes one of those groups will hold their nose and let something go, like the cities did on the ADU bill. But if one of those groups is vociferously opposed, there's just so many bottlenecks in the legislative process that you don't usually see that bill make it to the finish line. So if we can get environmental advocates and business advocates to agree on how to strengthen the housing element, I think that we're going to have to work with the cities and counties to get them to get to a neutral spot on that. But I think that's one programmatic tool for ensuring the delivery of more housing diversity in all parts of our state. And really, we've learned that all parts of our state are experiencing a housing shortage. It's not just Central Puget Sound. It has a slightly different flavor in different parts of the state, but Central Puget Sound is obviously where the prices have gone up the fastest, but it's not the only part of the state where people struggle to find an affordable place to live. So hoping that can be another component of our progress. Just a few bigger picture things. We're going to have a all remote or very nearly all remote session in 2021, which is going to constrain our ability to get certain things done. That's going to just reduce the throughput of the number of bills that we can get passed, as we have all of our committee meetings and all of our floor action in this format rather than in the one that we're used to. And we don't know how much that's going to reduce our throughput, whether it's a third or half of the number of bills we normally pass in a long session, but it is going to limit it. So trying to be as focused as we can on things that can actually make it all the way across the finish line. Police accountability is going to be a big priority for the legislature. That's not an issue I'm as personally directly involved in, but it's important to me, it's important to my district, it's important to our caucus. So there's a whole long list of police accountability reforms that are going to be priorities, including addressing restricting the certain kinds of use of force, what local governments do for police officers who have been shown to use unnecessary force and have a pattern of using force when they didn't need to, and how do we get officers out of that line of work who have shown they don't have the temperament to do it. So that's going to be a big part of our work, as well as revenue, and not just revenue both for the transportation network and revenue for the state general fund. There's a huge need for us to address unmet needs in the transportation network. And I think, for this crowd, probably most familiar with the unmet needs in terms of multimodal transportation and transit, as well as bike and pedestrian infrastructure. That's been my focus on the transportation funding side. But we also have unmet needs on the highway side. The biggest by far is fish passage barrier removal. We have between a $3 and $4 billion price tag on the work we need to do to remove barriers to fish passage on state highways. And that's a injunction that came down from federal court that we're required to fix all of those culverts within most of Western Washington is the area covered by that injunction by 2030. That's a huge, we don't have the money to pay for those unless we raise revenue. And that is a gas tax eligible expenditure, which I think is good because I don't see the need for a lot of new highway expansion projects. But I do see need for us to maintain our ferry system and build new ferries, of course, to replace fish passage barriers and to improve the operations and maintenance of our existing roadways. So those are all needs on the gas tax eligible side. I'm also hoping carbon pricing, as I referenced before, will be a big part of the solution for how we expand state support for multimodal transportation going forward. That revenue stream would not be restricted by the 18th Amendment and therefore will be eligible for things like transit. So I will be part of the work to try to get us the best transportation package possible so that we can address these unmet needs and hopefully address them by making pollution more expensive and not by increasing taxes that that don't help us make progress on our climate goals. And I could go on about that. I guess the only other thing I'll say is that really at the center of my work is fighting climate change. And so carbon pricing is a very important part of that. It's not the only thing. No carbon pricing bill alone is ever going to be enough to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to a safe level. So my top priority personally is the passage of a low carbon fuel standard. That's a law that we passed out of the House in 2019 and in 2020. It's stalled in the Senate both times. Because the oil industry really makes a lot out of their argument that it's going to make gasoline more expensive and has gotten enough votes in the Senate to keep that from moving forward there. But by mandating that oil refiners basically pay producers of cleaner fuels to lower the cost of fuel, of basically anything that's cleaner than gasoline or diesel, whether that's electricity, whether that's biodiesel, whether that's renewable natural gas or otherwise, to lower the greenhouse gas intensity of transportation fuels over time. This policy exists in California, in Oregon, and British Columbia. It's been very successful in all those places. It's been a driver of huge economic development opportunities in those states, as well as in Washington. We have fuel producers here who are exporting their fuel to Oregon and California where they can get a better price for it because they have a low carbon fuel standard in place. We don't get those fuels, we don't use those fuels here where there's a significant air quality benefit in addition to the greenhouse gas benefit, because those fuels burn cleaner than gasoline or diesel and emit fewer of the criteria air pollutants that harm human health, like diesel fine particulate matter, carbon monoxide, benzene, and so forth. So I will be working very hard to get that one to pass. That's not a revenue generator for the state. That's been part of the problem in the Senate is they say, well, why are you making gas more expensive if we're not going to get state revenue for it? My answer is always, well, it's an environmental standard, it's an emission standard, it's not a tax. So it's not every environmental standard should be judged by how much money does it bring into state government. But that's been part of the pushback that we have to overcome in the Senate. I do think we have a better shot of getting that passed in the Senate this year, just because of we did not change the overall numbers of Democrats and Republicans in either the House or the Senate. We're going back with 57 House Democrats out of 98 total House members and 28 Senate Democrats out of 49 total Senate members. But because of some of the Democrats who lost and some of the Democrats who replaced them, I think we have a better vote count on the climate question overall in both chambers, but particularly in the Senate where it matters. So I am hopeful that we're going to have a breakthrough session on climate in 2021. We had a breakthrough session on climate in 2019, not so much on transportation as on other areas of climate pollution like electricity and buildings and refrigeration, all very important, but none of which are nearly as large as transportation in terms of the slice of the how big of the emissions pie they constitute. So in order for us to really credibly say that we're a national leader on climate the way that we would like to be, we need to adopt strong policies on transportation. That includes a low carbon fuel standard, and that includes a transportation package that really invests in non-polluting modes of transportation more than we have in the past. So I see there's a lot of questions coming in, so why don't I stop there and start to hear which questions we want to go deeper on.
Great, that was wonderful. Actually, it was so wonderful. I think you knocked out like a good chunk of the questions we had written because you covered so many topics. Well, we want to start off with a pretty broad question, and probably a question on a lot of people's minds. Will big cuts be made in the state budget in the 2021 session, or will Democrats push for more progressive revenue sources? And I think the person who offered this also said, if not now, when we have a Democrat majority, then when?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, so I mean, I guess the good news is our budget deficit is not nearly as wide as we thought it was in June. That was the June revenue forecast was the sort of the low water mark when we were looking at a $9 billion shortfall over the next 3 years. And that really is an unfathomably large number. That was beyond the number. At that point, we could make horrific cuts and pass huge tax increases and still not balance the budget. And so luckily that shortfall has narrowed significantly. Now it's in the $2 to $3 billion range. We think it might go back up at the next forecast because of the current shutdowns and because of the lack of federal support for renters and unemployed folks. So we're really hoping for a breakthrough on federal support for those groups as well as for state government. But irrespective of that, we will absolutely be pushing for progressive revenue. And in the House, we've had support to pass a capital gains tax for several years. The Senate has not had that support. We are hoping that they're close enough now in the Senate that with some of those electoral changes I mentioned, that the Senate will be able to support a capital gains tax. That is a hugely progressive tool to really ask the beneficiaries of unearned wealth to contribute to state government, particularly people whose wealth has grown enormously in value, whether through the stock market or through real estate. So we're absolutely committed to that being a part of the plan. But there's other revenue ideas out there too. Some legislators are talking about a wealth tax. Some legislators are talking about a payroll tax, somewhat along the lines of what Seattle passed recently, but spread across the state and probably not at the same levels that Seattle adopted. The bottleneck has really been in the Senate, where they have a Democratic majority, but a significant number of the Senate Democrats have been of a more moderate persuasion and have not been as motivated to address the upside down nature of our tax code as we've been in the House. So I'll say voting for tax increases is very difficult. A lot of members from really competitive districts consider that to be the vote that could cost them their career, and they tend to be, at least in the House, most of those folks tend to be willing to risk their career for a vote like that, as long as they know it can get over the finish line. They don't necessarily want to vote for a significant tax increase if it's not going to end up being signed into law by the governor. So, do I really want to throw away my career and all the other things I'm working on for a vote that isn't going to see the light of day in the Senate? So that's why we are really talking a lot with our colleagues in the Senate about what their path is for progressive revenue.
Excellent, thank you. At the risk of jumping around a little bit, but while we're talking about revenue, will the Democratic caucus come to some sort of agreement on a type of carbon pricing to push forward?
Big question. I sure hope so. There are a couple different proposals floating out there for what carbon pricing could look like. I'm a supporter of cap and trade, which is, the key difference between cap and trade and a carbon tax. They have a lot of things in common, but the key difference is, where does the legal certainty lie? Under a carbon tax, legal certainty lies on what the price is going to be for a ton of pollution, and so there's more uncertainty over how much emissions will drop, but more certainty over what the revenue will be and what the price will be to someone who's paying that tax. Under cap and trade, we guarantee that the state will meet its legal limits, the statutory limits, which we just updated this year for what our state greenhouse gas reductions will be overall. And to me, that legal certainty is really important. I don't want to just trust that the tax will be high enough that will reduce emissions to a sufficient level. So I see a cap as something that's important to me personally in a carbon pricing proposal, so that we can credibly say that we're actually on track to meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals. There are concerns about cap and trade too. Some folks look at the experience in California and worry that could lead to greater concentrations of pollution and in communities that are disproportionately exposed to pollution. I think that's a real fear, and I also think it's one that we can address through the program design. So one of the other elements is, because carbon tax does provide you more certainty over what the revenue will be, there's interest by some legislators in passing a carbon tax and issuing bonds against that revenue stream to front load those investments, so we can spend a lot more money in the near term. It will cost a lot more money in the long term because we'll have to pay interest on those bonds, but it is a way to front load that spending. I think that's a really valid goal, but to me, sort of the absence of the certainty that we're going to reduce emissions enough, has me leaning in favor of a cap and trade model. That said, I think House and Senate Democrats both feel really strongly that this is an important revenue tool for us to both fund transportation, but also fund forest health and wildfire prevention, fund equity investments, and other greenhouse gas reduction investments. So I couldn't tell you with any certainty today that we're going to come together around something, but I'm really hoping so, and spending a lot of my time trying to, to bridge that divide.
Excellent, thank you. On another climate change related one, there's a couple questions about the regulation of internal combustion engine cars, including can we mandate sunsetting the sale of internal combustion cars in the state? Or alternately, is there a clean fuel standard as efficient as driving down ICE cars as something like joining the zero emission vehicle mandate from California and other states?
So we just this year, we adopted the zero emission vehicle standard from California. I do think that's a positive step. It is a pretty incremental step. I will say the clean fuel standard will be a much larger reduction in emissions than the ZEV mandate. And I'll get wonky about that for a minute. One part of the reason for that is because the ZEV mandate overlays on top of another California emissions regulation that we already have and that we've had since, I think, 2006. And so the existing law that we already adopted requires every automaker to reduce the greenhouse gas output from their fleet over time, over at levels that are set by the California Air Resources Board. So the ZEV mandate, which we adopted this year, goes on top of that. It also tells automakers, in addition to having these fleet-wide greenhouse gas standards, you also have to sell a certain percentage of electric or hydrogen vehicles each year. And that percentage grows over time, but it doesn't change the existing obligation under the low emission vehicle standard. So each automaker's greenhouse gas reduction requirements are not lower with the ZEV mandate than they would have been without the ZEV mandate. So if you want to think of this as the worst case scenario would be General Motors is now required to sell, say, 3% of their vehicles in Washington have to be electric, but that also means that they have a little bit more leeway to sell more gas guzzlers. So it's positive, but it's not determinative, and it doesn't drive emissions reductions anywhere close to the level that the clean fuel standard does. As far as phasing out gas-powered cars, I definitely want to do that, and we've seen some European governments move in that direction. That's great. I know Norway. I think Norway was the first. We see the UK and France and some others, setting targets there. Still not clear that states have the authority to do that under the Federal Clean Air Act. California has a lot more wiggle room than any other state to set their own vehicle emission standards under the Clean Air Act. That's why you often see us joining, like with the ZEV standard or the LEV standard, adopting a California regulation. California Governor Newsom has asked the California Air Resources Board to set a 2035 date for banning new gas-powered cars, but there's a lot of legal back and forth ahead between California and the federal government before we know if that's actually going to be allowed. Certainly, we have a better shot with the new administration than we do with the current administration. But I want to be sure before we adopt anything that goes that takes a different approach than California, that we think that can actually stand up in court.
Excellent. Thanks for getting extra wonky. while we're on the talking about modes of transportation, we have a couple questions about rail and electric bikes. Would you support subsidies or tax credits for electric bikes? And what will it take to get that passed as a similar benefit for electric car owners? And then I know the state came out with, I believe, a framework for a high-speed rail plan. Is that what Doug can correct me if I'm wrong, recently. Could you talk about the possibility of a robust investment in intercity rail transit in the state?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll start with e-bikes. I absolutely would love to see more subsidies or tax incentives for e-bikes. Representative Sharon Shoemake from Bellingham had a bill to exempt e-bikes from sales tax. I think that's great. The problem is, back to our tax code, whenever we grant a new tax exemption, whether it's a good one or a bad one, that reduces state revenue, and we have to make up for that somehow. So does that mean we, cut investments in K-12 education? Does that mean we cut investments in the social safety net? Or do we make up the revenue with another tax increase somewhere else in the ledger? And that's just never easy. It's just never easy to find a way to backfill, $5 or $10 million of lost revenue from, e-bike sales tax, for example. I do think that the electric vehicle fee structure right now is really punitive. And that, again, is something that certain Senate transportation folks insisted on when we had legislation in 2019 to extend and expand tax incentives for electric transportation. We essentially, reduced the sales tax on electric cars, but added a new annual fee that electric cars and hybrids would have to pay, which I just think was not a good move, either from an environmental standpoint or from a tax fairness standpoint. I'm hoping that our transportation package, if we're successful with that in this coming year, will remedy that inequity. But it's, yes, of course, absolutely want more incentives to accelerate less polluting modes of transportation. And it's never a policy objection that stops those things from moving forward. It's just the fiscal realities of where are we going to make up that lost revenue. I think the other question was about high-speed rail.
And actually, I want to interrupt. You should address high-speed rail, but the question asker actually inserted a clarification about that. It was not just high-speed rail specific, but about executing a 2006 era plan for intercity rail, basically improving all existing intercity rail, like Amtrak's Cascade. I just wanted to clarify that.
Sure. Yeah, those are two, related but different proposals. The idea that we're going to have, a super high-speed system like California wants to build, like you see in Europe, connecting Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland, many billions of dollars, but a good idea, a good way to unify our region. But yes, as an incremental step, I've been getting me more excited than those high-speed rail investments is just improving our existing rail service between Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, and points in between by making those spot improvements to accelerate Amtrak Cascades. Of course, the Point Defiance bypass was the biggest of those projects. That was enormously set back by the tragic derailment in DuPont a couple of years back. From a cost effectiveness standpoint, I think there's a lot to be said for just making those spot improvements. Most of the spot improvements we made before were funded by the Obama era stimulus package with its investments in rail. And I think those are very useful and cost-effective investments relative to the prospect of a brand new high-speed rail system. So that's kind of the highest priority for me in the passenger rail system is improving Amtrak Cascades. But if we have the ability to lay the groundwork for a future super high-speed system, that's great too. And I do think there's a lot of strong advocates for that in the legislature who will want to see big improvements in the passenger rail system as part of a transportation package. Again, those are not gas tax eligible expenditures. So those are things that come out of the slice of the pie that's available from multimodal investments. And so we always have the question as the legislature is, what's going to benefit our constituents the most? What's going to reduce emissions the most? What's going to move us to a 21st century transportation network the most? Is it improvements in local transit? Is it improvements in intercity transit? Of course, we'd like to do both, but we are operating in a world of constrained dollars and have to prioritize. So again, I wish we could do it all yesterday, but that requires the votes for taxes that we haven't gotten over the line yet.
Thanks for that answer. And yeah, I'm sure the trade-offs that you have to make and that we have to make as a legislature are never easy. Switching topics, you spoke a lot about SEPA reform and land use reform, and getting climate change included in the Growth Management Act. FutureWise has a package of reforms they're working on called Washington Can't Wait. Are you supporting their specific proposals?
Yes, that's what I was referring to when I talked about the climate element being added to the Growth Management Act. I think that's a long overdue priority. The Growth Management Act has been very successful in the things that it set out to do in 1990, 1991 when it was passed, which was basically at that time to stop sprawl from taking over rural lands, particularly farmland and forest land in critical areas, wetlands, steep slope areas. It hasn't been as successful until really the last couple of years in promoting growth in the areas that have the infrastructure to support growth. It's just become clear we need more changes both at the local and state level to accelerate that at the rate that we need. But I think the Growth Management Act is a very powerful and successful tool, and it needs to be applied to the challenges that we weren't as focused on 30 years ago, specifically climate, housing affordability, and equity and environmental justice. And those are all things that I think should be incorporated into GMA. I think realistically, to get those things done, we're going to have to find some areas that we can both support local governments fiscally, as well as find ways for residential home builders to also see benefits for their for their business. And I think they oftentimes we see pushes from building groups to expand urban growth areas. Not going to support that. But are there places that we can be more flexible, or either at the state level, or require local governments to be more flexible in terms of allowing development in places that are appropriate for development, so that builders can see some wins for themselves in that package too. Like I said before, I don't see things pass very often that are opposed strongly either by cities, by counties, by builders, or by the environmental community. And in the land use space, the environmental community is really led by FutureWise. And I'm a very strong FutureWise supporter. I was on their board for a number of years, and I am a big fan of their work. But I also know that FutureWise alone is not enough to get a bill like that passed, and so we're going to have to work really hard to find common ground with local governments and with builders in order to get the coalition we need to get some of those priorities into GMA.
It's interesting. I think you alluded to this. I grew up around here, and it seemed like for most of my life, the push to make changes in the GMA did come from builders about loosening up urban growth boundaries and allowing more sprawl. To now see it flip to people wanting to include more and make it more expansive. Are there other changes you could see wanting to make to the GMA to make it more effective?
Yeah, there's a bunch. One that I can foresee moving forward, that the State Department of Commerce, which is the agency that is was most actively involved in administering GMA, is more ability for local governments to, if Department of Commerce presents a model ordinance or sets some standards for what a comprehensive plan can look like, and if a local government adopts a plan that conforms with those standards, that then the state would assume the legal responsibility for defending that land use plan before the Growth Management Hearings Board. That is not the model that we've had for the last 30 years. When a local government comp plan is appealed, or any local land use decision is appealed, that local government is taking on a level of legal risk that is often very expensive for them. And so is there a way for us to have Commerce set a more uniform standard that allows local governments to have some legal certainty, and then puts the state on the hook for that legal action if necessary? I think that's where you come into tension between the fiscal realities of local government and the policy desires by local government to be making their own decisions. those are in conflict sometimes. And this is an example where if a city or county is willing to relinquish a little bit of that autonomy over their decision making, they might get a lot more legal certainty, and that's going to be attractive to a lot of local governments. So that's one of those areas of potential trade-offs. As long as that commerce drafted plan is strong and is meeting all the goals of the GMA, then that's a place where where local governments that choose to relinquish some of that local control can save some money probably and have a little more confidence. So that's one. There's also a land use designation in rural areas called a LAMERD, limited area of more intense rural development. It's a very limited allowance for certain kinds of development outside of UGAs in areas that are like oftentimes just like an intersection of two major highways in a rural part of the state. We have very few of these in King County, but there's a lot in some of the more rural counties in the state. Among the limitations on that is, they can't develop any further beyond what was already built up in 1990. So extremely geographically constrained, and I don't really want to change that. But there's also a lot of limits on what uses and intensities of uses can be allowed within a LAMERD. So like if you have a dance studio and you want to convert it to a yoga studio, you can't do that. So maybe a little bit more flexibility on allowing different uses, maybe allowing the intensity of use to increase as long as the infrastructure exists to support that change in intensity. That is something that's really important to some Republican legislators. And so maybe that's somewhere that we can build a little bit of bipartisan support to get some of the changes that are more important to us in urban areas through.
Thanks. Maybe this is a little bit broader of a question, but you've sort of touched on it in many different ways. And how do you see the relationship between the state and the local government as far as zoning goes? And it seems like, as you said, Washington has a pretty hands-off approach, but I know Oregon seems like their legislature has a much more, and their Growth Management Act has a much more aggressive state role.
Yeah, I'm supportive of a stronger state role, and I've been clear about that all along with the local governments that I think that there's a state interest in having affordable housing. I think there's a state interest in fighting climate change. I think there's a state interest in using our tax dollars in the most efficient way possible, which means having growth happen in places where we don't have to extend a sewer line or build a new fire station out in the rural areas. So I'm supportive of a stronger state role like they have in Oregon, but not all of my colleagues are. And a lot of my colleagues, not all, but many of my colleagues who come from local government just are not philosophically supportive of that strong of a state role. And so just, in terms of what's necessary to build the coalitions to get some of these laws through, we often really have to, recognize that a lot of people really prefer the more bottom-up approach of our Growth Management Act relative to Oregon's approach, where in Oregon, every local land use plan has to get approved by the state. In Washington, that's not the case. A local land use plan gets adopted and is presumed valid, and then citizens can appeal that to the Growth Management Hearings Board, which means the Hearings Board can strike it down or can find it non-compliant or whatnot. But there's not a role for a state agency, and this is sort of what I was talking about with the Department of Commerce and the safe harbor provisions, to say yes or no. Now, the Department of Ecology does that with the Shoreline Master Plan, but with your general comprehensive plan, the state doesn't do that. To me, that would be an okay thing to do, but we're not, I don't think, going to get that anytime soon, just based on where I know my colleagues are. So it's all about kind of finding where, how can we incentivize local governments to do the right thing when we've tried incentives and we're still seeing certain local governments that are failing, that are falling behind in terms of their delivery of a diversity of housing types or a sufficient supply of housing. Then, and the accessory dwelling unit bill is an example of this. Sometimes then you can build enough support to get a mandate through. But we always have to start and often spend a long time at the incentive phase before we can say, okay, some local governments have really failed to step up to the challenge, and we're going to have to go a little bit further in terms of the mandates.
Great. This is a specific question, and I don't know personally the bill that is being referred to, but hopefully you do. Can you please speak to whether HB 2780, it's a single family, might be reconsidered in the Environment and Energy Committee?
Yeah, so this was a bill that would have required missing middle housing types in cities throughout the state. And so, requiring duplexes and triplexes to be allowed in zones that are currently single family. Again, I'm supportive of that. I've been supportive of local governments that have taken that step. Most local governments haven't done that throughout their entire jurisdiction. They do it in some parts of their jurisdiction. I'm a co-sponsor of that bill. As I've been saying, that approach has not had enough support to pass so far. The statewide missing middle approach, which is basically what Oregon did a couple of years ago. While I'm personally supportive of that, I think it's unlikely you would see something that ambitious make it all the way through the legislature, and so that's where we have to look for opportunities that are maybe not quite as ambitious.
Thanks. What can we see with respect to reducing building emissions, namely building codes and natural gas appliances?
Yeah. So we have a very strong state energy code for new buildings. If you were to build a new single family home today and you have to comply with the 2018 energy code, your building is going to be quite efficient. Very little air leakage, a lot of efficient appliances required. So most of the problem here is with legacy buildings. Yeah, I live in a home that was built in the 1940s. It's pretty drafty. I'm going to remodel it and it'll hopefully be less drafty after that, but there's, I think, probably a lot of us in that category. So while the energy code itself is really been successful in improving the efficiency of new buildings, we have to figure out what we're going to do with existing buildings. We did pass a strong law on commercial buildings in 2019. That was House Bill 1257. A first in the nation standard for large commercial buildings to have to achieve a certain energy performance standard, which the Department of Commerce is in rulemaking on adopting right now. So we don't yet have a policy in place that requires existing residential buildings to meet that standard. And I think there's a lot of, that would be a really heavy lift, I think, because of the number of homeowners, including low-income homeowners who would be subject to that requirement. But it is important that we fund that. That's one of the things I'm proposing in the carbon pricing as an expenditure from the carbon pricing bill is more energy weatherization assistance to homeowners, particularly low-income homeowners. There is legislation that the governor's office is working on right now to accelerate our work on buildings. I unfortunately don't have that right in front of me right now. They have sent me a draft that I haven't had time to review yet, but that would, among other things, remove certain statutory preferences that exist for natural gas, amend some of the regulatory processes of the Utilities and Transportation Commission to sort of tilt the playing field away from natural gas, which currently it's pretty favorable for gas utilities to expand service. We had legislation in 2020, which we didn't get there yet with, but which would allow electric utilities to provide more incentives to a homeowner. So the example I use here is that I have a gas furnace, and City Light can offer me incentives to get a more efficient washer or dryer because those are electric, and Puget Sound Energy can offer me an incentive to get a more efficient gas furnace. But City Light can't offer me an incentive to switch out my gas furnace for an electric heat pump. Fuel switching is not allowed in that transaction. So we tried to authorize public electric utility or public and private electric utilities to provide those kinds of incentives. For a lot of legal reasons, we're not sure that we can that one quite passes constitutional muster yet. But we're looking at a lot of things like that can accelerate our progress towards electric. Particularly space heating and water heating. Those are the really big uses of gas in homes that we most want to move towards electric on. Also, people are, I think, aware of, gas stoves and appliances like that being contributors, but really it's space heating and water heating where you see the by far the largest energy use in homes. And so what can we do to electrify as many of those applications as possible? There's not easy answers for that yet, but I know that the governor's office, I wish I'd fully digested that bill before getting this question.
I wouldn't worry about it. You've had great answers and in-depth answers to everything. I'm impressed how you're able to keep track of the minutia of every one of these issues. What about the possibility to allow local governments to have stricter residential energy codes as they do now for commercial?
Yeah. So that was the bill I mentioned on commercial buildings, House Bill 1257. Our first in the nation building performance standard for commercial buildings over 50,000 square feet. When that was first introduced and when it passed out of my committee, it included the ability for local governments to have stretch energy codes. We didn't quite have enough support to get that one all the way through. We had to remove that provision in order to have enough support to get the bill out of the House. The biggest objection that you hear to that, which I don't necessarily share this objection, but this is what people express concerns about, is do we really want a patchwork of energy codes? Are we really going to have Olympia have one code and Tumwater have a different code and Lacey have a different code? And what if there's a residential development that crosses city lines? Half of them have to meet one energy code and half of them have to meet the other. That's the argument that you hear, and that's the argument that's carried the day on stretch codes so far. I don't know that it will forever, but so far that's been persuasive enough. We had 0 Republican votes for any of these bills, just to be clear. So you only have so they have to peel off just a couple Democrats in one chamber or the other, and home builders who have been the real opponents of the stretch codes have been successful in making that argument so far.
Great. The 34th district is composed of many unique the question is transportation situations and challenges, but also different urban and rural challenges. How do you view urbanist ideas or lack thereof on the multiple and varying jurisdictions that the 34th covers, including Seattle, Vashon Island, Burien, and I would add White Center?
Wow. Yeah, I don't know how to fully answer that. I mean, Seattle's
kind of a broad question.
Out front, ahead of most cities in the state in terms of allowing growth and encouraging growth. I know that, a lot of people still have frustration with the amount of Seattle that's zoned single family, but, even within a Seattle single family zone, there's a lot more things people can do with their property than in most cities in terms of ADUs and duplexes and so on. Not everywhere, but more than most. Burien has tried to catch up in the last couple of years. Burien had a great ADU ordinance that they adopted. Burien's seen a lot of growth in their downtown. I know that they're collaborating with their neighboring cities in South King County on a housing action plan, which would probably lead to more actions along those lines. White Center is a urbanized area. I live within Seattle city limits, but I'm a block north of White Center. And, King County has only 2 heavily urbanized areas, White Center and Skyway, within unincorporated King County. And it's just made it hard for them to get the attention that they need. And they also hard for the county to have the revenue they need to provide urban level services there. I think White Center would be better served if it were to annex into either Burien or Seattle, but that has not been successful so far. So, I don't foresee a lot of land use changes in White Center in the years to come until they become part of a city. Vashon is, of course, a rural community where, there's less growth there, in part because they, have unique transportation challenges, and also because they're outside the urban growth area. And so there's some development in the Vashon town center, but we don't really want to see a ton of growth on Vashon because we don't have a lot of capacity in the ferry system for huge growth there, and don't foresee that being real low carbon growth. So yeah, it is a pretty diverse district. That's the great thing about the communities I represent. But I try to stay apprised of what's going on in each of those communities, but also try not, trust the local governments to make the decisions they need to make within the contours of what the state asks them and directs them to do.
Excellent, thanks. I'm going to jump back to a topic we sort of touched on earlier, just because someone seconded this question. WashDOT needs to acquire more train sets to restore Amtrak Cascades to 2019 service levels once we reach the post-pandemic situation. Will the legislature make sure the Cascade service can be continued and expanded? And you touched on some of this earlier, but.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, that will be one of the many spending priorities that people have to advocate for as part of the transportation package development. So, if that's something that's important to you, to see Cascade service improve and grow, and be maintained, I guess, first and foremost, but then that's important for you to let your legislators know that that's a priority for you, because Cascade is a state responsibility, and those train sets are not cheap. But I think if that's something that you want to see funded in a new transportation revenue package, make sure your legislators know that's important to you. I would like to see it, but again, we always have to make these hard decisions over okay, so we have $10 million. Do we want it to go to King County Metro to maintain bus service or expand bus service, or do we want it to, go to Amtrak Cascades? Those are not easy choices because they're achieving different purposes, even though they both advance the cause of a less car-oriented transportation network.
Thanks. Another specific one. Would you support the I-5 system partnership funding in 2021, covering planning for maintenance and repair in the entire Puget Sound corridor?
Yes, I think so. I don't know if I'm familiar with that exact program or proposal, but yes, I-5 needs a lot of work, and I think the operations and maintenance component of a transportation package will need to really prioritize I-5. But I don't know if I know enough about that exact package to weigh in with with much knowledge.
Okay, great. We just had an election, and there's some new folks coming in. Are there any new people in the legislature that you're looking forward to working with, and anything you want to engage with them specifically on?
Yeah, there's lots of new legislators who I'm looking forward to working with. Senator-elect Tawana Nobles down in the 28th district in Lakewood and West Tacoma and DuPont. A great change from her predecessor, Steve O'Ban, who was his main goal is to destroy Sound Transit. That's a hugely positive change in that district. I know Tawana is going to be on the Transportation Committee, so that's exciting in the Senate. In the House, a number of new legislators I know are going to be really focused on some of the issues that we've talked about. Representative Jessica Bateman from Olympia, who served on the Olympia City Council, was really the leader of the effort, one of the leaders of the effort to adopt middle housing across Olympia. I think she's going to be a great housing champion in the legislature. Representative-elect Liz Berry from the 36th District in Northeast Seattle, I know is very focused on improving transportation equity and fighting for multimodal transportation. Representative-elect Kirsten Harris-Talley from the 37th District in Southeast Seattle, I know is also very focused on environmental justice and transportation equity. And there's many others that I'm excited about too. I know those are a couple of the ones who I know have really prioritized housing, greenhouse gas reduction, and transportation as part of their campaigns.
Yeah, I think you listed a bunch that we were all very excited to see join the legislature this year. I know as a resident of the 37th, I was very excited to see Kristen Harris-Talley win and be my representative. We're almost out of time. So I have two quick last questions. If there's just a couple things that you could magically get done next term, and your dream legislation that you could get passed, what would it be?
If I could magically do anything, I would get us to zero carbon emissions tomorrow. I haven't been successful with that yet. I think, passing a strong carbon pricing program that is guaranteed to achieve our aggressive state greenhouse gas reduction targets would be huge. I don't ever think a carbon pricing program alone is enough to get us there. So I think we will need complementary policies like policies on buildings, like a low carbon fuel standard. But those package of things would be pretty high on my list. Having climate planning as part of GMA, up zones in as many parts of the state as have, frequent transit service and can support multimodal transportation as possible would be too. But if I could only pick one thing, I guess decarbonizing the transportation system would be through, whatever means possible is pretty much at the top of my list. It's, climate change is the thing that, got me to do this job in the first place and gets me out of bed in the morning. And I like to joke that I'm going to try to keep doing this work until we solve that problem. And fortunately, that may be employment for life.
I think you've listed a lot of great policies that that I think most of the people, I almost said in this room, but in this Zoom call, support. What can we do to help you all in the legislature get this through and make progress?
It really, I think, just is impactful for you all to build relationships, particularly with your own legislators. To make the time to get to know the three legislators from your district. And, I don't know everybody on the call, but, the folks that I know on the call are mostly from Seattle. And it still helps in Seattle. You may have one one of the ways I talk about this is, you know, everyone's somewhere on a scale from 1 to 10 on how strong of a climate champion they are. You know, maybe your goal is to get your legislators from a 7 to an 8, you know, or an 8 to a 9. They're there, but it's not their focus. But you can still meet with them and say, I know it's not your focus, but can you help, you know, get these 3 things done? Can you, you know, what can you do to help make sure that this gets done? I want you to, and the deeper you build that relationship, the more they're thinking of you when those bills come up. You know, they're thinking, I don't want to disappoint Patrick by not having this bill come up that he talked to me about back in December. You know, if hypothetically, if any of you lived in a district with a Republican lawmaker, you know, they're mostly pretty low on that 1 to 10 scale. But, you know, getting somebody from a 2 to a 3 helps too, or a 3 to a 4. And not everybody's, your goal with all those interactions is you're not usually going to change somebody's mind in one conversation, but, you know, over time, making sure that they know who the people are in their district who care about climate action, so that they, when they go home at the end of the session, they have some good news to share, is really impactful. And I would say it is totally fine if your legislator is not, you know, climate or urbanism or housing or transportation is their #1 thing, but we all vote on all the bills that come up. And so making sure that they know that even if you, my legislator, are focused on K-12 education or the behavioral health system, that I also want you to remember that I'm really here to ask you to support strong climate legislation. That really helps. And so you can, you know, certainly feel free to write all the legislators, but you know, most legislators are not going to pay a lot of attention unless you're from their district. So I'd really say focus on your own legislators, get to know them, you know, be in their inbox regularly, and figure out where they are on that spectrum and what you can do to help them be just a little bit stronger of a champion.
Great, that seems like great advice. I think we're basically at time, but I want to say thank you for spending an hour with us tonight, and thank you for all your great answers. It's wonderful to know that someone who is clearly so passionate and knowledgeable about all these issues is devoting, I'm sure, an ungodly amount of time to the people of Washington State and trying to make our state a leader in climate solutions. Awesome. Thank you so much. Enjoy the conversation. And thank you all for coming out tonight and spending time. Hopefully we got to your question. All right, have a good night. All right, thanks.
Thanks for coming, everyone. We appreciate it.